In the final level of Yoshi's Island, Starry Night will be used as the background during a screen. At first glance, the use of Vincent van Gogh's masterpiece feels a little out of place in a platformer about a green dinosaur carrying a baby. No, when you stop and think about it, you realise there's some significance to the choice of painting. Seeing as during my most recent playthrough got me to thinking, Yoshi's Island might be the video game equivalent to Starry Night. Much like how Van Gogh deemed it a failure for relying on abstractions, several members of the team had doubts with Yoshi's Island's art style due to how it deviated from the mould at the time, a mould standardised by Donkey Kong Country. As time passed though, the abstract nature helped make Starry Nights one of the most appreciated paintings in history. Likewise, we believe that Yoshi's Island's choice of graphics is a major factor to its own fame. These graphics are nothing on their own though, and we're hoping that this video will explain how the visuals worked with the core game design to create one of the greatest platformers ever made. It's pretty inevitable that Miyamoto's infamous quote about Donkey Kong Country would have to make it somewhere when talking about Yoshi's Island's graphical style. Donkey Kong Country was released a good chunk of the way through Yoshi's Island's 4-year development cycle, long after the team decided to go with hand-drawn art, which was chosen by director Shigefumi Hino purely to go for something different. This was a process that involved scanning actual drawings for the backgrounds and characters, then replicating them in pixel form. According to artist Hisashi Nagami, this procedure took quite a while to perform, which is understandable considering how technologies used to produce graphics weren't nearly as advanced as they are today. Why am I telling you this? Because I want you to imagine how it must have felt to have been told that, when Donkey Kong Country was released with its fully rendered graphics, the style you went with didn't have enough punch to it. Their words, not mine. If the quote Shigeru Miyamoto provided for an interview with Stephen Kent is anything to go by, the developers still carry some resentment about the marketing team's interference. While Miyamoto doesn't hate Donkey Kong Country, he wouldn't have tried to revive the series if he did. It's clear that he felt using its art style would have been more of a detriment to his own project. How strongly did the developers take this bad faith criticism? They decided to double down and push Yoshi's Island even further towards a cartoon aesthetic. This helps to strengthen the comparison made earlier between the Yoshi's Island team and Vincent van Gogh, whose work was infamously unappreciated to the point where he was unable to sell a single painting. It's speculated that his art was doubted by the public for its real nature, going against the realism that was popular in France at the time, which is eerily parallel to how Yoshi's Island was looked down upon for not pandering to the boom of Silicon graphics. The final release of Yoshi's Island turned out to be more similar to Donkey Kong Country than one would think when reading the development notes. While it isn't the complete derivative that the marketing team were probably hoping for, the similarities are still rather surprising. Several of these seem identical on paper, but the execution of them differs significantly between the two games. The most noticeable example on the surface is their use of 3D graphics. Donkey Kong Country used them as the crux of its art direction, whereas Yoshi's Island only occasionally utilised them, although the periodic use of them sometimes doesn't feel like an artistic decision. A good example of when they're used well is during Bert the Bashful's Fort, where what seem like stylish wall panels will move into the foreground as an obstacle. Here the choice in visuals is being used to play a trick on the player and will have them on their toes each time they visit this level archetype. I'm in a good mood right now, so I'll spare you the symbolism of having 3D graphics show up when the bad guys reside. The main cynical use of them is in the story cutscenes. After Nintendo's logo pops up, the player will be viewing a cinematic which uses 3D models. This won't be followed up on until the ending, or if they don't save Baby Mario in time. While this in no way hampers the quality of the overall experience, it contradicts Shigefumi Hino's statement about fighting back against the idea of going halfway if 3D graphics manage to weasel their way in. While it's thankfully nowhere near close to a compromise, judging by the way the developers speak, it was probably preferred that they didn't show up at all. It really goes to show just how heavily the marketing team at Nintendo wanted to recapture Donkey Kong Country's magic. Fortunately, the aforementioned instances are the only times when this approach to character design shows up, and the gameplay isn't hampered in the slightest bit. I'm not trying to suggest that these 3D graphics, nor Donkey Kong Country are bad. Far from it. What I'm trying to say is that the developers chose this art style for a reason, and an unnecessary inclusion of anything else would suggest a conflict of interests behind the scenes. There are many examples that I could go on about. Both of their early game sections make use of rolling objects, their health systems both try to reinvent the wheel, and they both depend on vehicles in order to break up the monotony. A similarity which particularly intrigued me was the use of snow to cover the screen in their obligatory ice worlds. Most ice levels in platformers tend to enforce a new set of physics which the player has to learn. These have had their ups and downs over the years, but for the most part they've turned off players due to being a fleeting addition to the toolbox that doesn't have much payoff. While both games have those same slippery physics, they play a more backseat role to the use of a blizzard to make the levels feel more frantic. Donkey Kong Country's use of snow was on and off, making it feel like a standard procedure with a different aesthetic at times. Yoshi's Island, however, mixed the blizzard with an influx of enemies, bottomless pits, and Baby Mario as a test to the player's hand-eye coordination. It almost felt like driving a car during a snowstorm. While the point of DKC's level was probably to show a dynamic weather shift, which in itself is worth respecting, Yoshi's Island's commitment to the hazardous side of winter makes its approach more memorable. Instead of feeling relieved that they won't have to deal with any more slipping and sliding like in a typical platformer, players would be pleased with themselves for being able to deal with several obstacles at once within a fast-paced environment. The rush that's being offered here is what caused people to fall in love with the genre in the first place, not devoting time to interacting with an approach to level design that has situational use outside of its designated section. If the fact that Yoshi's Island spawned several sequels is anything to go by, the hand-drawn look was a triumph. Not just because it's a timeless style that anyone can relate to, but because the developers ensured that the graphics assisted the gameplay as opposed to overshadowing it. The level designs in particular received a huge bump from the SFX2 chip utilised by the game. This gave the artists room to create set pieces that would allow each part to stick out in the player's head. In Super Mario World, while the stages were well designed, they pretty much existed as platforming challenges that tested hand-eye coordination, maybe hosting the odd secret exit here and there. With Yoshi's Island, however, while the overworld map opts for a linear design this time around, the areas all have a distinct identity to them. A one that everyone remembers is Touch Fuzzy Get Dizzy. It starts out fairly typical, seeming rather in keeping with the rest of World 1. After the checkpoint though, you'll start encountering fuzzies raining from the sky. Touching the previous obstacles have resulted in the game's infamous Baby Mario cry, so the player's first instinct is to try and avoid them, but the rate they're raining down is so constant that you'll end up getting hit. What results now is a drastic change to the level, with the background and hues becoming greatly distorted. This alone should make navigation more of a challenge, but the designers took things a step further by exaggerating Yoshi's movement as well. This turns what was an average stage into a fever dream that makes platforming even the simplest sections a lot more difficult. Touch Fuzzy Get Dizzy isn't memorable just because of the visuals. It's because said visuals aid the level design by creating a unique challenge for the player based on the background effects. Yoshi's Island also manages to overcome a trap which a lot of cutting-edge media succumbs to, which is blowing their load too early. When a media text has pioneered an innovative technology, it can have a tendency to show it off as quickly as possible in order to spread word of mouth. Children in the schoolyard, or even man-children on social media, will be easily impressed by what's on display, so naturally they share their experience with their friends or followers. Naturally this attracts more buyers, making this a win-win solution for everyone involved. I have nothing against leaving an impression early on, but sometimes this mindset can result in a lackluster product towards the latter portions. Yoshi's Island manages to avoid this by spreading out the highlights throughout its 6 maps. In fact, World 5 is arguably where the game peaks. This is due in part to the gradual shift from an ice to a sky aesthetic. Again, this subverts expectations, with the levels going from sliding sections typical of snow stages to moons with ravens running on them. Heck, it's not as if the ice stages go for the usual mechanics themselves. A good example of this is Danger, Icy Conditions Ahead, which plays out like a typical ice section, testing the player on their ability to adapt to the sliding physics. Though you're well awarded for this test with a ski section which throws the sliding sections out the window and goes for a downhill ride where you have to jump over the obstacles. The player is also treated with a break from the typical Baby Mario routine, where getting hit will just have you tumble into the snow, resulting in a humorous animation of Yoshi rolling down the hill as a snowball. It takes all the irritating aspects of the previous parts aside and delivers a fun stage that's still challenging thanks to the numerous bottomless pits, whilst offering a treat to the eyes with charming animation and a Christmas morning-like background against the snow. a nostalgia case setting that anyone can relate to. The Ski Yoshi is perhaps the embodiment of why this stage works so well, with it both being a unique visual gimmick whilst offering a twist to the core gameplay. Miyamoto wasn't kidding when he said that the game boasted several magic tricks. This level, along with World 5 in general, demonstrates how careful the team was when showcasing the graphics, ensuring that every part had sections that would impress the audience with the art style and the unique ways it's implemented into the stage design, not just cramming the surprises into the early game as a cheap way of selling the game to the masses. Compared to the earlier Mario levels, which are linear in terms of progression, Yoshi's Island will occasionally opt for the more open-ended approach which bestsellers like Sonic and Donkey Kong Country were using at the time. These probably come back to Hino's statement about how they had done everything they could with a side-scrolling jumping game. While this is conjecture, I also believe that the occasional switch to open levels was also done to push their hard work with the visual concepts. If that was the case, then the decision paid off, as although some of these levels can be quite the brain teasers, they're challenges first and not simply a gallery for the team's artwork. Marching Mile Mild's Fort's a good example of this. Most of the level consists of the player going through each side of the fortress in order to gather keys and get to the boss. While this sounds like any other puzzle that needs to be solved in the game, the beauty of it comes from a visual trick which plays with what's expected from this sort of level. The way how the 4 pathways are laid out will cause a savvy player to think that they need to guess the right room to find the key. When they find a key and open the lock now, they'll be confronted with another barred door. That's when they'll sniff the coffee and realise that they need to explore every nook and cranny in order to get to the boss. While this might not be what a veteran of the previous games would want, it can't be denied that the structure smartly takes advantage of a convention that's common to genres even outside of platformers. Am I still allowed to call these platformers? Either way, even without depending on the art style specifically, the game isn't afraid to utilise the visuals in a way that aids the ideas which the team had for enjoyable and memorable levels. No one aspect where I felt that the open-ended nature backfired was the handling of 100% completion of this game. Instead of Mario World's approach where there was a secret exit which could be found depending on the level, this game has you collect every little item to unlock a bonus stage for each world. This is disappointing when you consider that this is following up how a Super Nintendo launch title handled optional content. While doing the exact same approach as last time would have stagnated the idea and served as a poor fit for both the level design and Yoshi's moveset, I believe that the execution of what we ended up getting could have been far less tedious. The secret exits were layered. You could either use them to take a shortcut, get an extra challenge, or merely for bragging rights. Here, only those who want a gold star on the start menu will get any benefit from performing scavenger hunts in every level. There are no interviews explaining why they made this decision at the time of making this video, but from what I can conclude, the team may have gone overboard when trying to stray away from the main Mario games. If you go further and bring the approach back to my previous conjecture, it could also be said that the time spent drawing these collectibles had diminishing returns if several chose to ignore them. In our video of Super Mario World, I mentioned how poor the bosses were. They barely put up a challenge and platforming was never an important part of the fight. They were by far the most boring parts of their own levels. In Yoshi's Island though, they end up being some of the most memorable parts of the entire game. Considering how platformer bosses are typically rather lacking, this is a rather impressive feat. Surprisingly, one of their chief assets is the visuals. Not only are the designs fun and creative, they'll often tower above Yoshi in size. This will both intimidate the player, even if they can look a little clownish, and allow for some clever strategies against them. Bert the Bashful has his size act as his weakness, as Yoshi can aim eggs at any part of his body. As he is a giant, this is extremely easy to do. This sounds like a rather lame idea for a boss, but keep in mind that this is the very first fight in the game. It's a perfect opportunity to see if you've been using the aiming mechanics properly, but being big can only get you so far, and Prince Froggy turns the tables so you're the one on the receiving end of Kamek's magic. The player shrinks rather than the boss growing. This will normally result in a battle where the challenge is based around having to keep your eyes on a smaller Yoshi to control. But expectations are flipped again by having Prince Froggy straight up eat you. The egg mechanics are still utilised, but this time you win the match by aiming at the uvula, which is difficult considering the amount of obstacles that end up in the stomach with you. It's a creative setup that uses a set piece as a canvas to produce a unique boss fight. Most of the bosses use aiming mechanics as the primary method of disposing of them, however some of them opt for more unorthodox strategies, and Raffle the Raven does this by making you do some platforming. Yoshi's three forms of offense consist of jumping, hurling eggs, and ground pounding, the latter of which is a mainstay in most modern platformers. From my experience, the ground pound is often a slower, more cumbersome version of the jump that I tend to avoid. Ironically though, Raffle the Raven works precisely because of my problems with the move. The set piece of this battle is the moon of all places, albeit a more cartoonish version that's just large enough to hold both Yoshi and Raffle. This allows for one of the best looking images on the Super Nintendo, yet the set piece is actually a massive bottleneck for the player. It's too small, and Raffle's too fast. The main method of hitting him is ground pounding the posts, timing your moves so they hit Raffle from underneath. Unfortunately for the player, they have to wind up the ground pound in sync with Raffle's movements. More often than not, they'll be too slow for Raffle, causing them to have to think about their timing. It's a fantastic fight that arguably acts as a rite of passage for both you and the game. For you, it's a test to see if you're ready for the final world through the use of a difficult boss. For the game, the battle proves that Miyamoto's correct in that fancy graphics only have meaning if the gameplay is good. In this case, Raffle and the rest of the bosses prove this by mixing creative visuals with challenging scenarios. One of the most discussed parts about this game is the final boss. Both the music and the idea of fighting a giant baby Bowser make for one of the most celebrated moments in the series, meaning that I'm going to talk about the seemingly humble first phase. This part of the fight is arguably as important as the giant face because of how it makes use of the ground pound. If you respond to Bowser's stomping tantrums with your own kind of stamping, then it's plain to see that the two of you will be in a mirror match. In order to get the advantage in said mirror match, the player must time their ground pounds in response to Bowser's in order to deflect the shockwaves, an exercise which involves them watching the exact point when the waves peak. It's a simple concept, but what makes it work is how it serves as payoff for your use of this one ability throughout the entire journey. As good of a game that Donkey Kong Country is, the bosses were sorely missed opportunities to utilise the individual quirks that each monkey had. While the ground pound was used to great effect in some of the game's other boss fights, having it play a part here is particularly special since it shows that the developers wanted to have players interact with each layer of Yoshi's moveset at all times, even at the very end. If they weren't going to build up to an ultimate use of this ability, then it wouldn't have been worth drawing animation for it and all the obstacles that required it. Oh, and bonus points for putting graffiti in the wall of Bowser's Playroom. Even the target audience will catch on to how this is a faux pas. Now we can get to the part that everyone likes. A fight so good that even the latter-day Mario games like to ape it. If the Playroom fight was designed to take advantage of the ground pound, this one tests both how you aim Yoshi's eggs and how you maneuver the creature itself. Oh, and when I said that this whole gauntlet involved all of Yoshi's moves, I lied. Eating will only save you some jumping when grabbing eggs. However, this works because the tongue is the one move the player will be using the most, so of course the final showdown would be when the developers get you out of that comfort zone. While the player has been doing a lot of jumping and aiming as well, these skills take a bit more effort to perfect compared to pressing the action button. Comparatively, the player must respond to platforming challenges quickly so as to dodge the fireballs which grow as they near the screen. And they need to land on platforms which are much smaller than what's usually dealt with, meaning that the player must use the hover's airtime carefully if they want a chance of victory. The use of aiming is particularly special though. To land a hit, you must get a shot that synchronises to both Bowser's movements and position. This is easier said than done though, as his size will change as he gets closer to the camera, making some shots go from a direct hit to a dud. While the fight is meant to be taken on by children, your skills with aiming in accordance to both factors will change how quickly you win. It's this sort of design that separates plays like this to chickens like me who need to wait for an easier shot. The graphics designers didn't make this boss huge entirely for spectacle. The size goes hand in hand with the shockwave effects from the previous phase to produce a fun way of having the player give everything they've got from the last dance. Going back to what I said at the start, I don't believe Yoshi's Island is a starry night of video games for no reason. Much like Van Gogh's works, it was met with skepticism in comparison to its more realistic contemporaries. But the fact that it prospered through the substance that supported its unorthodox nature honestly inspires me as someone who often doubts if my own work is good enough. Everyone likes to root for the underdog, or under Poochie in this case, but this game thankfully is more to stand on than just a cute status. Instead of creating a moveset and a set of levels for Yoshi just to show off the Super FX2 chip, the latter was an avenue for the developers to explore what they thought would be the next step forward for the series. And what a step forward it was. It has more appeal to newcomers of the medium than the last 4 Mario games, but there's enough ingenuity with the level designs to leave veterans of the genre satisfied. While it doesn't do everything better, it's difficult to deny that few entries in any other series were as bold as this game in a time where silicon graphics were deemed the way to go. And thus concludes the Mario World games. I somehow doubt we'll be covering the rest of the Yoshi series unless demand is high. Too much of a headache and too many remakes of the original masterpiece. If reception for both videos is good now, then we'll keep the platformers coming. Otherwise, well, we'll at least know what isn't our forte. Please leave a comment, a like, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching.